The race is on, and with Formula One launch season rapidly approaching, the watching world is eagerly anticipating the first glimpses of 2021's not-so-new cars. But where does each team need to improve, and what are the chances of them doing so? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to answer those questions are Gary Anderson, Scott Mitchell and Mark Hughes. Gary, hello. Does this time of year bring out a little bit of kind of post-traumatic stress disorder or something from your memories of rushing to get cars ready?
Yeah, it does, but it's very, very different now, and again, it's very, very different for this year because obviously the cars as such, we call them carryover from last year, not quite, but the same basic chassis structure and whatever will be in place. So this year is probably going to be the easiest year for teams to identify the problems from last year and probably rectify them. So if there is such a thing as a year of the grid closing up, from my point of view, 2021 should be that year because it's the first time we've had this type of scenario. Yeah, there's a few little changes, and it'll be into each team to sort of dissect them correctly and optimize the car around it. But I think 2021 could be the closest season we'll have seen for a long time.
That's a nice upbeat, positive note to start on. Mark Hughes, do you share that positivity? Obviously, a few little aero changes this year, but looking forward to getting to see some of the cars, even if they are carryovers.
Yeah, I do, and it's quite interesting when you look last year at the teams that made progress. Quite a few of them were just doing it with quite sort of unfashionable cars. I'm thinking of like AlphaTauri. Is a good example where they just kept working and an established theme, and it was getting better and better and better, without making any great revolutionary changes. So, if there's going to be a continuation of that through the grid, I think we might see some quite interesting things, pictures emerging. I don't think we're necessarily in for just a copy and paste of last year. I know that Red Bull, for example, is pretty sure it's on top of its problems and is very, when you talk to them, very sort of bullish about the prospects of their car. So I'm looking forward. I think it's going to be a very intriguing season.
And Scott Mitchell, are you also positive? And which car are you most excited about seeing?
I guess what's ostensibly the newest one of all, which is the McLaren. Obviously, switching back to the Mercedes engine. So that's, I don't know. I just feel like that might be the car that gives us the most to look at. But I am quite curious to see sort of Mercedes versus Red Bull and see just if there are any sort of distinguishable differences at the rear of the car with the aero changes. But actually, on the new cars, I'm quite. I don't know why, but for some reason, I'm quite enjoying the names of some of the cars at the moment. We're seeing a few Bs come back, aren't we? When was the last time there was a something B in Formula One?
They did go out of fashion because teams like to deny that they were B-spec cars. I suppose when the mad upgrades started happening with great frequency, the B-spec car became redundant. When is a car a B-spec car, Gary, and when is it just a new car? Where's the line?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a very fine line between it. I think, whenever if you've built a car around the same chassis, let's say, a specification around that same chassis, it should be called a B car because you haven't sort of gone the whole hog. During my years, we had many different engine changes like McLaren have had this year. And it was so many that it was a new car every year because the back of the chassis had to be different. But if you've built your 2021 car around the same chassis as the 2020 car, then I think a B spec is not the wrong thing to call it, to be honest.
Yeah, I'd like to see a little bit more of that. I'm a bit disappointed that there's not more of them, but we've got a few teams doing it. Williams have gone with the B, haven't they? Trying to remember who the other ones are.
The McLaren have called their car the MCL35M. So obviously last year was the MCL35, and now it's an M because of the switch to the Merc engine. I think the Red Bull is going to be a B, RB16B.
I remember, Gary, you did an M26E once, didn't you?
Yes. E was for effort.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's a huge effort to try and get that thing on the ground, so it was christened E for effort. But yeah, again, it's a sort of relative thing, to be honest, because if you don't change the main sort of structure of the car in my book, which is the survival cell or chassis, whatever you like to call it, then I think all the rest of it around it's just ancillaries. And those are the type of things, all the rest of it, side pods, whatever, nose, front wing, as we've seen on many occasions, engine cover, whatever, they can all be changed during the season as such. So they're all just add-ons to the main sort of backbone of the car. And I think the chassis is the thing that, for me, would dictate this is a new car, needs a new chassis number. And actually interesting, talking about chassis numbers, I've got the old Jordan only ever 191 chassis plate that we used whenever the car was tested in the black in 1991. And Porsche didn't like it, so then it got the sort of 911, and then it got changed to 191. So chassis plates should make up your chassis, and that should be part of it. And actually, to be honest, nowadays in the chassis I think there's 3 chips that the FIA can detect to see. They're in the cockpit sides and in the front of it somewhere, and the FIA can read those and see if it is an existing chassis or if you've got a new chassis. So we should really know from the FIA's chassis log.
So when it came to the Jordan 911, you got the chassis plate and Eddie Jordan got the Porsche.
Yeah.
Very good bit of dealing there you've done, Gary. I think
I didn't have the opportunity. Anyway, those Porsches, I don't like those Porsches. I had a Transit van; it was much better.
Excellent. Well, we're going to go through each of the 10 teams. We'll start at the back of the grid and work our way through some of those, talking about what the teams need to improve. Obviously, everyone wants a faster car, a bit more downforce, greater air efficiency, all these things. So we'll take those as a given, but try and drill down into the specific things we're looking out for. So, Scott, let's start off with one of those B-spec cars we've been talking about, Williams.
Yeah, I guess the easy answer is they need to improve everything. Primarily downforce, like I guess every team is chasing. But with Williams, what we saw in 2020 was obviously such a big step from where it was before. So the same step in terms of performance is extremely unlikely into 2021. But where they sort of specifically need to aim for is success in that little Class C group at the back would be good for them, because Haas and Alfa Romeo should expect to make quite a nice progression because of the Ferrari engine. And also, a team like Haas, which I'm sure we'll get into, didn't upgrade their 2020 car, and so Williams does face quite stiff opposition at the back of the of the grid. They do also need to be careful about how they balance this transition from 2021 work to shifting full focus to 2022, because that's obviously the biggest opportunity for Williams. But I think this is going to be basically a continuation, basically part 2 of the 2020 project, which was about making sure all the processes were working as planned, making sure that the developments they bring actually sort of bring what they're hoping for, and basically just trimming away at the disadvantage or the deficit that had set in over the previous couple of seasons especially. So it's not really I don't think it's a specific target in terms of Williams needing to focus on one area. I think they view their weakness as a sort of total overall weakness. One thing that will be interesting to note is that the new owner, or new owners, I never know whether to call it singular or plural, but Dorilton Capital, there's just been this sustained injection of funding, and there was even more over December and then into January. So I think they've now, on top of the 40 odd million that they put in to sort out the debts and the loans, they've added another 40 million quid. 40 quid won't get you much in Formula 1. 40 million quid in, and that's basically put into upgrading or installing new facilities and technology at Grove, because that was the area they fell behind. So I assume with the work that they were doing on the 21 car, a lot of that would have already been done by the time this renovation work at the factory would have taken place. But in terms of production and stuff like this, I'll be interested to see if we see any tangible gain from that at the start of 2021. I think basically this year is another sort of pigeon step for Williams. The leap, if it's going to come, isn't going to come until 2022.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Scott. The thing about, I always say, is nobody goes out and builds a bad car. They build the best car they've got. And the tools you have are what you base it around. That's what your design and your optimization comes around, your tools. So I think Williams had fallen behind quite a bit, still are behind probably. But the biggest thing whenever you've got that situation, is to recognise it and don't just believe everything that's coming out of your tools. Think about it a bit deeper as well. Think about why you're different from other cars. Think about why you could be missing the point until you get the tools there to prove it. It's the same. It's just following McLaren's trend. McLaren, I said for quite a few years, they were believing their own hype. They believed they had the best situation, the best people, the best tools in the pit lane. And they really didn't, There's nothing wrong with their people. The tools they had just weren't efficient at doing the job they needed to do. And they weren't capable of reading between the lines. And they believed, they believed their own hype about how good they were. So I think Williams will take a step. The biggest step is just in the fact of second-guessing everything. Just don't go down the route of believing everything. If you do a massive Excel sheet and it comes up with a number at the bottom of it, do you believe it and just walk away? I've always used my mind to try and work out what that number should be roughly, so that you would, in your own mind. So whenever it comes up with the answer of 4, and I think it should be 10, I would question it and go in and see why that could be. Is there a reason for it? So they need to think outside of the box a little bit until they get the tools around to actually prove their design philosophy, I suppose you might call it.
I guess one of the specific things which, Ed, you probably know a bit more about, considering you spoke to some of the brains behind the Williams design at the end of last year, is one of the things that did emerge as a very specific problem over the last couple of years was drag, wasn't it? It was a draggier car, and then because the priority was, it was more important for them to put more downforce on the car than it was to take some of that drag off. I think sort of creating more, it's usually referred to as like more efficient downforce, isn't it? That was kind of a second order priority to adding more downforce. So I guess that would be a priority on the 21 car.
Yeah, they were sort of working through some of the... they were so bad, really, in 2019. They had some really serious things to take. So they went for kind of brute force downforce as the first order priority and then started to whittle away at it. So this is kind of the process they're going through, becoming a team capable of producing a good all-round car. And really, the focus has to be on 2022. But that doesn't mean 21 isn't important, because this is a car that, well, as Gary says, start to prove if some of the processes in the spreadsheets they've got are spitting out the right numbers. And if they're not, then they've got to really understand why. Because if your spreadsheet's spitting out the wrong numbers for the 2021 car, it'll certainly be doing it on the 2022 car. So that's, I think, what it's all about for them. This is not an irrelevant year, but the real work, the really important work, will be done behind the scenes with the 21 car as a bit of a test case. Should we move on to Haas, Mark? Obviously, we can take it as a given. They should have a more potent Ferrari customer engine, but a team in an interesting position, aren't they?
They are, yeah, and they've more or less said in public that they're surrendering this year and focusing on 2022, and have no great expectations of this year, and they're very tightly budgeted, etc. But as you say, they will have a big, hopefully a significant power boost, which is that's going to help. And the other point is that last year they did zero development on that car because of the uncertainty of the finances and in the pandemic, and where they were with their budget. So that very, very basic version of the car that appeared at the first test was the same car that was running in Abu Dhabi at the final round. So it's quite a false picture that it was where it was, really. So there is a lot in the pipeline that could be brought. Now, how much of that is going to be totally relevant given the regulation changes that have been made on the floor, we don't know. But you would expect that there's going to be at least some of that is going to transfer. So I don't think it's necessarily a complete no-hoper, and I think we should be looking out for sort of green shoots there to sort of launch them nicely into the new formula of 22. I don't think they're set for one of the, like in 2018 they were a very respectable midfield level car. I don't think we can expect anything like that, but I don't think they're going to be hanging off the back. I think they will at least be able to compete.
Quickly to sort of interject there, if you actually take Haas relative to their performance in 2019, they lost less than Ferrari lost. So, in theory, if you look at it and say the engine loss for both of those teams was going to be the same, then Haas did a better job with the chassis than Ferrari did. They got a lot more to gain, but they lost less. So at the end of the day, they should be fairly buoyant about it and, go into this year thinking that they can learn a bit. I wrote in a column that I did that, they should experiment a bit this year because it's the old theory. You've got to prove to yourself whether you know what you're doing or not. Now, if Haas go out on this year's car and they find themselves, 1%, 2%, 3% more downforce for no consequences, then that's fantastic. But if they find themselves 2 or 3% more downforce, but the car's a lot more pitch sensitive, they have to evaluate whether that will actually work on the track. And unless you actually make the bits and go and test it on the track, you don't know. And that could very much influence how you're heading down the road in 2022. So I think 2021, you need to not just give up on it. You still need to experiment a little bit, to prove to yourself your path for 2022 is correct. The cars will be different, but at the end of the day, to the driver, he just wants grip and he wants consistency. So the end result to the guy with the steering wheel in his hand is the same. It doesn't matter whether it's a 2021 car or a 2022 car. You need to give him confidence.
In that article, if anyone wants to dig it up, it's Gary Anderson writing off 2021 to focus on 2022 is foolhardy, which looks at that whole idea, which kind of grows out of the 2009 Brawn that you should completely abandon years. That was an unusual set of circumstances. Should we move on to Alfa Romeo, Gary, the Sauber team? Strange performance trends we've seen from them over the past few years.
Yeah, it is strange performance. I mean, they have definitely got a measure in there, and Kimi Räikkönen, and they should be able to be measured because of him. We know that Kimi, given a car with some pedals in it and a steering wheel, will drive the wheels off it. I mean, that's what he does. That's what he enjoys. There's nothing else in his reasoning for being in Formula One other than to go fast. So that what they've got and what he does with it is genuinely what they've got, and they've got to react to that. And I haven't seen that happening. They've been a bit in the doldrums. They've had the odd, fantastic weekend relative to for themselves, but then they've had more that aren't fantastic. So I think they need to start looking at themselves very, very carefully and see why they haven't made progress, because that's really what it's all about. Yeah, it can be budget, it can be lots and lots of stuff, but they genuinely haven't sort of looked at their car at the beginning of the season and gone, oh, okay, we've got these little bits of dramas here. Let's attend to them, and as the season progresses, we'll get better. They don't seem to be able to get that bit under their bonnet. Very, very little progress is really made. So I think it's not so much the fact they can't do it; it's just the fact that they're not recognizing it and actually applying themselves to the problems. They're going racing. They're a decent race team. They're going racing. That's it. But they're definitely not attacking the car and making it better.
They seem to just be a little bit weak aero-wise, don't they, Mark? You did a piece over the end of the year period where you pointed out that maybe Charles Leclerc had flattered them a few years ago, and that partly explains the downward trend we've seen. But that team should be doing better aero-wise, shouldn't it?
Yeah, there seems to have been quite a bit of upheaval in the technical department. There was 2 years ago, there was a big recruitment drive, and it was mainly in aero. They found that they'd probably been a little bit overambitious with that, and that the manufacturing couldn't really keep up with it. And so they've tried to balance it out a bit in the last year or so. But then at senior level, there's been changes in personnel. It has the feeling that it's not really particularly stable inside there yet, and it needs to be given a little bit of time for everything to find its place. That's just the impression I get from the outside. In terms of the car itself, Gary was referencing how much the Haas lost with compared to Ferrari. Alfa lost even less. Alfa was a couple of tenths down from 19 to 20, whereas Ferrari was about 6 tenths down, I think. And it's not that it was a disaster last year. It wasn't always bringing its best game, and I think that was probably complicated by the power unit issue. Because it's got different aero sensitivities, different tracks. So you were seeing that the thing go up and down a bit from track to track. But I think there's nothing about Alpha really that should prevent it. I don't think inherently should prevent it from being a decent level midfield team, which it was looking like it was, at the time that Leclerc was there. He was, making real progress with that. So, I don't think we've seen the sort of final iteration of that team. I think there's something still needs to be played out to get it to its optimum.
To quantify those numbers of loss, I mean, Ferrari, I do it in percentages because it takes in the whole season, but Ferrari lost just over 1% from 2019. Haas lost 0.9%, and Alfa Romeo lost 0.6%. So you're right in saying they made it better. They lost less in 2020. But still, at the end of the day, we know that Kimi, as I say, can be a top end driver. He's done it in the past, and he never loses his talent. He just has one of those guys that drives for the sake of driving. So they always want to do better, but they need to push on a little bit and believe in themselves and actually believe in where they are and try and rectify the situation to close that gap up to the midfield team a bit quicker.
It's just never felt like they've got a complete handle on what needs to be improved. And I remember, was it Silverstone last year where there was some talk from the team where they're like, we changed quite a bit and tried a few things and either did work or didn't work. And it sounded like they were getting to the point where they were having to experiment quite a lot to try and work out where the limitations were. I think whether they've got a handle on that into this year, I don't have like a huge confidence that they're just going to start suddenly excelling, even though that is fundamentally a good race operation. Part of that is because I just think, even if that car is, relative to its opposition, slightly more competitive than last year's one was, I'm just not convinced by that driver lineup. Obviously, Kimi is someone I think you can just rely on him to go out and just do it somewhere between a good job and a very good job. But Kimi's not going to go out and do like a George Russell, suddenly put the car 11th or 12th on the grid. Kimi's more likely to qualify 16th and somehow finish 9th or something like that. But it's the second car that's sort of the bigger problem. I feel like that team is only ever really going to go into a race weekend with one car likely to be in the fight. Because I just think Antonio Giovinazzi is just a bit... I really like him. And I think he does have some really good moments, but can just be a bit... that team's just lacking in a few key areas in ways that I think a team like Williams isn't, for example.
It was the last team to get a driver and loop simulator. And even at the beginning of last year, they were saying, we're hardly using it yet. We're still trying to understand it. We're still trying to develop it. And I wonder how much significance there is to that. Any views on that,
it's
Gary?
Tough. Again, it's a bit like my Excel sheet. You've got to get the correlation. You've got to have the data to get the driver in the loop simulator to sort of operate. You've got to get correlation between the track and your wind tunnel data, how you express your tyre data, your mechanical side of the car, the suspension, the stiffnesses. All that's got to be in line and it's got to correlate. So, at the end of the day, we can all blame this correlation thing. The track doesn't show what we can find in our simulation or from our numbers. But actually, the track's the real thing. The track's where the stopwatch is. The track's where the prizes are. So that's real. That's what's happening. And it's the other stuff you've got to make sure you develop in line with making the track better and not vice versa. Because I think so many teams, fight the correlation issue, but they fight it at the wrong end and try to get it to correlate with the track, their data from the wind tunnel. And it doesn't work that way. So if they're behind, they're behind. It's a bit like we were talking about with Mercedes or with McLaren earlier, a couple of years ago, and currently Williams. They've been where they've been in Switzerland for a long time now. The equipment they have in Switzerland is what they had for quite a long time. They haven't really invested capital investment into the company over the last few years. So maybe they need to take a little step at that and try and get equipment that will allow them to develop the car back at base and bring time to the racetrack. At the minute, I don't think they're doing that.
I think there's quite a lot of tidying up to do at that organisation. Really, there was that expansion, wasn't there? When I remember when Vasseur first took charge, and then they had an influx in investment. They expanded the I think it was the aero team, for example. But then it was almost like I think they spent a good sort of 12, 18 months making sure they had people in the right places. Obviously, Simone Resta came in from Ferrari, and now he's disappeared. So there hasn't been a great deal of consistency. So it's almost like what investment they did have just seems to have, it's not been wasted, obviously, but it's just, I don't think it's been best utilised. It sounds like we're sort of collectively a little bit underwhelmed by Alpha 1. Ed, do you want to have a go at explaining the prospects for Alpha 2, AlphaTauri?
Yeah, I think AlphaTauri is quite simple, actually. They had a nice season last year, making good progress. And I think it's really just more of the same for them this year. And I know that sounds dull, but for example, they had the opportunity to take the Red Bull rear end because under the token regulations, if you're a team that takes your non-listed parts from another organisation and you were running 2019 spec last year, you can have a free upgrade to 2020 spec. So that impacts AlphaTauri and Aston Martin, not Haas, because they had 2020 Ferrari kit last year. So that stays the same. But they've decided not to take it. Jody Egginson, the technical director, said that they thought long and hard about doing it, but they felt it was best for them to really focus on the concept they've got and continuing to progress. And they made great progress last year. There were times last year when that was the third fastest car towards the end of the season on a given weekend. Obviously, they won a race, but that was a little bit of an unusual circumstance. But consistent point scorers, you see Pierre Gasly popping up with these kind of 5th, 6th places, really strong performances. So I think AlphaTauri just needs to be on that same trajectory. Just a little bit more consistency is what I'd most like to see from them. I think you probably agree with that, Gary, as you've been calling for that for a bit.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And, the end of the season, the last 4 races sort of show that they were improving each weekend. So I think they went into this winter period with quite a lot of motivation. I think they've, again, with Honda, they're getting a better relationship there. Now, Honda's pulling out at the end of this year, but for sure, Red Bull are going to be pushing Honda pretty hard. So I think AlphaTauri could benefit from that situation quite quickly. They could be the big beneficiary. But what I'm saying is, really, at the end of the season, it looked like they knew where they were going with the car, and obviously Honda were doing a good job as well. So the line was going the right way on the graph, if you know what I mean. So I look forward to them this year because I think they can do a good job.
They've got the extra challenge of adapting to using the 60% wind tunnel, the Bedford tunnel that Red Bull uses. They're going to move in to share that. There was a great article that Gary did over the end of year period as well. The short-term pain AlphaTauri's 60% wind tunnel move may cause. I'd suggest everyone have a look at that. But AlphaTauri, just stay on the same trajectory. Scott, should we move on to the first of the big guns, Ferrari?
Yeah, which is it's weird that we're coming to Ferrari so early in this run through, but such was the dismal effort of their 2020. I guess the easy answer for them is obviously engine is the priority in terms of progress for 2021. It was the Achilles heel last year, and it was also responsible for the biggest shortcoming on the chassis side as well. Obviously the car was just draggier than expected because it had less power than it was originally meant to be working with. So you sort of, they'll get sort of compound gains from an improved engine. How much of a step they can actually make obviously remains to be seen. But they've been talking quite confidently over the last couple of months. The first dyno runs of the 21 engine seem to bring very positive feedback from team boss Mattia Binotto, but I think there are only going to be they're going to be limited gains because the size of the step back for 2020 when they were making sure they complied with the various FIA technical directives, I think is the most politically correct way I can phrase it. It was such a big step back that it showed that within those rules, Ferrari had a worse grasp of them than any of the 4 manufacturers, which means that they then have to learn an awful lot to get on level terms because it shows that they couldn't be at that performance level that they were at in 2019 within the TDs. So I don't think that's a 6-month project or a 12-month project or whatever it's been, which means they're not going to be, I don't think they're going to be fighting for race wins again in 2021, but I think it would be disappointing if Ferrari didn't start the year, I don't know if already in third place, but I think it would be very disappointing if they weren't more competitive than they ended 2020. And I think they should absolutely be finishing third in the Constructors' Championship in 2021, because there has been enough time to make that step. And they'd obviously proved by the end of 2020 that they seemed to have a relatively decent base for the car, considering how underpowered the engine was. So, yeah, all hope is not lost for the Tifosi, but I don't think they're going to be cheering a Charles Leclerc win at Monza again in 2021.
You've got your spreadsheets there, Gary. I'm sure I saw you peering at them. Obviously, the step for them to get to third best is actually quite small, isn't it? To say it's 3 places, but it's only a few tenths of a percent. But so we shouldn't kind of overestimate how effective that would have been as an improvement, given how much of an upside there should be from the engine and the chassis.
Yeah, very little will move them up into that third place for sure. It's one of those sort of difficult things, because obviously their goal should be, let's say, podiums. That's what they need to be regularly challenging for, podiums, I think, in 2021. If they've done that, they've done a pretty good job. The problem lies with most cars. If you've conceived your car basically with a downforce level that you think you've got, and let's say just a nice round number of 1,000 horsepower, and you've got your aerodynamic package and drag package that sort of suits that 1,000 horsepower to give you the reasonable speed on the straight, or pretty good speed on the straight, and suddenly somebody takes away 100 of that horsepower for you, the car goes slower on the straight. And if the car, again, like I think last year's car had, if the rear end is nervous on corner entry, the last thing you can do is sort of reduce the downforce level or reduce the drag level, because that means taking off rear wings. So suddenly you've got a bigger problem with the rear end of the car, corner entry. You lose lap time because of that, and the driver makes mistakes. So you're in this circle of events that just you can't get out of, and you can't get out of it quickly enough. It's easy to say, "I'll run less wing and the car will be faster on the straight," but actually your lap time isn't necessarily better. So they need to patch on the engine to get themselves back up the power level. And if their engineers have spent a lot of time devoted to getting the best out of challenging the grey areas, I think, as you called it, Scott, of the technical directives, then they haven't spent the time on getting the best out of the regulations as they're written. So they've got to learn all that again. So I don't expect them to take that 100 horsepower step, let's say, that they're missing. 50 of it will be a big help. And if they can also build a car that hasn't got a nervous rear end, that they can run less downforce on the car, then they can be back there again. So, as I say, third in the championship is the minimum they should have, but I think a bunch of podiums is the minimum they should be challenging for.
Mark, there's been kind of mixed messages from Maranello about the engine progress. Bonotto's publicly been very positive about it. He said at the end of last year that they felt that had they been allowed to upgrade the engine during last season, obviously it was homologated for the year, they'd have at the very least not been the worst engine package by the end of the year. So there's clearly going to be an upside, but how big an upside do you think we should expect from that?
I think significant. I think we should be seeing a sort of double whammy, shouldn't we? We should be seeing the benefits both of the power unit and the correcting of the basic instability, which, as Gary said, arose from that sudden whipping away of all the power. So they've had a full year to work on that, and they've made no secret of the fact that they were devoting a lot of time to the 21 car from very early in the 20 season. So no, I'm quite optimistic. I'm not expecting them to come back to being challenging Mercedes, but I'm quite optimistic they're going to have a semi-competitive season.
Well, one of the teams, Mark, in that midfield group they'll have to get ahead of is Alpine, the new name for the Renault team. A few changes there with Cyril Abiteboul gone, but car-wise, how confident are you? They made good progress last year, but there's still some question marks hanging over just how good a chassis they can produce, aren't there?
Yeah, and I mean, that's basically the 2019 chassis that they've ended up being frozen to run 3 seasons. So it's not the car that they would have done if they'd had the freedom with the regulations being frozen for the pandemic. But yeah, they did improve last year, but they had quite a lot of improvement to do. And it was, I think there's still questions about the stability there. That was a new technical team that sort of the season was already, I think we're about March time before the new guys were able to start. The senior technical people, Dirk de Beer and Pat Fry. So Yeah, that car, that wasn't their car, but they had, the previous technical leaders had done a pretty good job of improving what they had. So we haven't really seen that line of continuity. We don't know really how it's going to be, and there's also this question of stability of the management. We not quite sure yet how the team is going to be run and who's got which responsibilities. So yeah, definitely a few question marks hanging over that team, but it's a very solid core of engineers in there. So they're not going to have a disaster, I don't think. But whether they can continue that climb against you're getting some pretty around that part of the grid. There's some very, very able teams. You got the McLaren, Aston Martin, Ferrari. You're in a pretty hot competitive part of the grid there. So to keep that progress, to keep that curve pointing the right way, I think is going to be quite a challenge.
Yeah, when you look at them, the progress they made, I thought from between Silverstone 1 and Silverstone 2 looked like a positive step. And basically they were able to do exactly the opposite of what Ferrari couldn't do. They were able to run the car with less downforce. And the car aerodynamically seemed to come alive. They were running less downforce. And that's normally down to the fact that something on the front wing assembly or the barge board area that's affected by the front wing has got airflow separation problems. And whenever you're applying more downforce to it, that problem gets worse and worse. So by reducing the downforce, they seem to find their way a little bit. And I thought that would carry through the year, but it was still a bit up and down. But I think in general, they learned a lot from that period, because when they did have a track where they had to put the downforce on, and again, I'm trying to look through here, Barcelona, for example, they were 2.1% off the pace. And the next race at Spa, they were 0.8% off the pace. So that's a big switch, race to race. So when you needed a track where it was actually really down to downforce, they struggled quite a lot. And if you take, again, I'll go to Turkey, which was mainly downforce oriented because the track was so slippery, they were over 3%. That was their worst race of the year. So whenever you needed downforce, I think their car didn't respond to it well and generally created a problem. And whenever they were able to run less downforce and get away with it, the car actually became a lot better. Now, the engineers should be able to analyse that in quite good depth. It's not just about downforce, it's about consistency and making sure the downforce is there when you need it. And as I say, if you put high downforce in the car, normally you have to put more front wing on it. Normally that makes the wing work harder, and you can lead into dramatic aerodynamic separation problems.
Adjusting to the new aero rules, the rear of the car, the rear of the floor, especially this year, is going to be a big test for this the Renault technical side. But as Mark was saying, they came in so late. The influence on the 20 car was minimal. Obviously, the fundamentals of the 20 car are carrying over, but there is at least this influence they can have on aero for 21, and that's a huge test for Alpine, because that's the only area I see this first opportunity for the new look technical leadership structure to have a proper influence on a car. That's what I see as their main advantage going into this year. The rest of it, I don't really see sort of where they make the step compared to others. You look at McLaren switching to the Merc engine, or Aston Martin with an evolution of the pink Mercedes. And even as Ed, you were explaining the momentum for a team like AlphaTauri and the engine gains we're talking about for Ferrari. These are all pretty significant areas to expect these other midfield teams to make a pretty good step in 21. I might be doing Alpine a massive disservice, but there's not really anything about that organisation that gives me as much confidence as, say, the other teams in the midfield. And that's not really meant to be insulting of them. It's more indicative of how competitive that midfield is. So as I said, we're talking about Ferrari as the sixth team going into 2021. So that's an indicator of just how difficult it is to actually make an impact.
Gary, shall we move on to the team in that midfield group that's trying to haul itself clear and could well do that this year? Aston Martin, obviously it's a team you built because it used to be Racing Point, Force India, Spiker Midland and Jordan. So I think we should be getting excited about what this team can do, but what sort of step will you expect to see, given that they are working with the infamous pink Mercedes?
Well, my involvement with that team was a long, long time ago, but I am very proud to say there's still some people there that came up through the Jordan School of Motoring, as we used to call it. So it's nice to see them there and being successful. Andrew Green, the technical director, is a really good guy. He's grown with the team getting bigger, which is quite decent. But they need to watch as a team that they don't sort of outrun themselves. Getting bigger is one thing, but you have to make sure that it's all working for you. You can't just focus on pulling 100 people and say, right, okay, guys, get on with it, because it'll just lose its way dramatically. They have a good working way. They have a good working way at the track, which pulls them in some results whenever they probably didn't deserve it from speed. So as a group of people, they have a good operation. Moving forward from last year, is obviously it's still the same sort of deal. They will learn from the Mercedes from last year, and they will apply that, I'm sure, to this year's car, i.e. the rear end of the car, the rear suspension that Mercedes had last year, some other bits and pieces they can blend into their own package. But they're one of the only teams really that has good, solid experience of building a fairly competitive car with a high rake solution, and also changing direction last year and building a competitive car with a low rake solution, albeit a pink Mercedes. But they've still got all that data that shows them the reasons that one way was better to go than the other way. And they can apply that now. So they've got two sort of sets of data that takes them in different directions, and they can definitely benefit from that as far as exploiting one of them a bit further, because you got 3 points on your spreadsheet now, or your graph sheet: high rake, low rake, and then this floor change at the back. So you're not going to head back into the high rake sort of sensitivities because of the floor change, because you know where it'll take you to with the problems. So you'll try and exploit the low rake possibilities that bit further. So they're a team that this year could do a very good job. Now, have they lost the yardstick in Sergio Perez? Because Sergio was there for years, knew them, knew the team, understood the car, the facilities, the reaction to everything, and now they've changed that. Lance Stroll, I don't doubt him as a decent driver, but you still couldn't put a pin in the dartboard as to how good he is, really. You don't know. He shows up one weekend and he's very good, shows up another weekend and he's not quite there. So I'm not sure how good he really is. And Sebastian Vettel's still got a question mark over him if he's lost his way a bit. I think his motivation will be back, but they've still lost that measure that was Sergio Perez to get them sort of focused in a direction. And I think they'll miss that. But as a team, I think they can do a good job. And I think 2021 could be their year for mixing it at the front.
Mark, you've been getting excited about the potential of the Mercedes rear end on that car. That combined with obviously what will have to be the team's own knowledge and interpretation of how to develop the car. Do you think we saw signs that they've got a really good handle on it, that they can put a bit more of their own stamp on it for 2020? Because, of course, aerodynamic development is free.
Yeah, and as we went through last season, you saw that they were getting more and more out of the car. In fact, the most productive period for it was when they weren't putting any new bits on it. They were just understanding what they had more. And I think that's only natural when you're essentially taking over someone else's design. You don't know why it was created the way it was. So obviously it's going to be a bit of a voyage of discovery. And I think we'll just see that continue into this year with what's essentially the same car, but with the upgraded rear end. So yeah, I think it's potentially very exciting, that package. I take Gary's point that there's still a question mark around the drivers, just because of the season that Seb has just had. But Seb as a driver not only needs a nice environment, which he will have now, he needs rear end stability, and then the low rake type of car seems to give that more readily than the high rake. And so I'm optimistic that we can begin to see the return of the real Sebastian this year. And if we see that, then yeah, I think they could have a very strong season.
I think the challenge for Aston, which we really interesting to see how it develops is where they start this year, having had that chance to evolve the so-called pink Mercedes over the course of last year. Because I felt like by the end of last year, that car looked like a really, really sort of well-sorted and potent machine. Obviously, it had its peaks earlier on, but I can't remember what race it was, but it felt like a long way into the season where we were still discussing that this team had sort of lost a little bit of its efficiency. You know how it was once a team that wasn't necessarily the fourth fastest car, but it was definitely like the best team in the midfield, and that was what was making it finish fourth. But then you could just, first half dozen races of 2020, you could reel off so many missed opportunities from the team. I felt like that went away towards the end of the year, especially. So it'll be really interesting to see sort of if they can if they start 2021 with proper momentum and they've really got a handle of this concept and they've enjoyed sort of the work they've been able to do. And a team, Gary was talking about Andrew Green just now, with the resource that team now has. I'm quite interested to see sort of what an Andy Green-led technical team does with the aero changes for this year. I do really rate Green and that technical operation, so I'm actually really optimistic about what they're going to do. But I am also absolutely fascinated by sort of the continuation of this Aston McLaren fight that we saw at the end of last year. But I've already spoken and waffled in this answer for way too long. So Ed, do you want to pick up McLaren? What are you expecting for them? What do they need to improve?
Well, McLaren have got the most obvious and interesting challenge. They're the only team that's changing engine supplier, switching back to Mercedes, which they last used in 2014. Obviously, their development tokens effectively vanish in that they've got to, basically everything they do is to accommodate the Mercedes engine. They've got to prove that anything they change is to accommodate that. So they've really gone for that. Quite a big challenge to adapt to a different power unit package. There are certain regulations to try and make that a little bit easier in terms of certain commonalities of architecture, but really it's still a big old job, and trying to put it into a carryover chassis, which was never the intention, because of course this was going to be for the new rules, which were meant to come in for this year prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, slightly changing the whole world's plans, in fact. So that's a really interesting thing. Ultimately, they've talked about the fact that this is akin to a new car. That's what James Key, the technical director, of course, another Gary Anderson protege, has said. And there's just as many new parts on the car as there were when they went from the 19 to the 20 car. So it's the closest thing we've got to a new car this year. And I'm interested to see how obvious the differences are when it comes to those packaging challenges and fitting it all in. Will we see the odd area where the bodywork's bulged a little bit because there's something they need to put there that they didn't have to before? We see areas where it's narrowed, and how big will the compromise be? What do you think, Gary? How awkward a challenge do you think this is?
Well, the challenge is obviously it's very, very difficult to optimise the Mercedes engine relative to the Renault. The detail of the back of the chassis, for example, the hard points or the positions of the engine mounts on the back of the chassis have to be in the same place. So your actual structural chassis is not that much different. The areas you put the loads into stays in the same sort of place, but it's all the other stuff. And we saw, courtesy of Roman Grosjean, his accident, how complicated the back of these chassis are, in relief for all the stuff that's going on there. And every engine's different, so the whole back of the chassis will be different, but the end structural points are all in the same place. The same with the gearbox. So it's about detailing all the cooling systems and getting that sorted out. That's not easy because they are all different. Every engine has got sort of a different set of heat rejection figures for oil and water. You've got air-cooled intercoolers, water-cooled intercoolers. You've got such a combination of bits that you can do. Turbo location, turbo piping, all the intakes, everything is going to be different. So in effect, they are building a new car. I know that it's not classified as a new car, but at the end of the day, I think there'll be quite a few people upset if suddenly McLaren go out there and end up sitting in the front of the grid wherever the first race is, all quite happy. I think there'll be a few people upset that they're a year ahead of everybody else as far as they've got a new car and we haven't. So it'll be interesting to see their competitive level, because at the end of the season, they were doing an excellent job. They have got the continuity of Lando Norris. So driver-wise, Daniel Ricciardo is obviously a different driver, but Lando Norris is the yardstick for them. We know there's no miraculous step with the Mercedes engine relative to the Renault. Yes, it should be better, but should it be better by 1% or 5%? It's nothing like that. It's tenths of a percent, to be honest. So they need to be a little bit careful of how they show their hand, I think, because if it's too good, it could be questioned, and if they haven't made progress, then they've gone backwards. So difficult thing to sort of balance, difficult balancing act, I think you might call it for McLaren this year. But I think the team in itself has grown so much since the last of their Honda days with Alonso. It's grown so much. It's so much more engineering driven through its approach to it all. There's definitely not so much warm air going on within the team. They're real people, and they're really doing a solid job, including my old protege, James Key.
Mark, do you think that this is a good opportunity for McLaren this season, or do you think it's one just to be got through, given the compromises, especially given that they're defending that really coveted third place of the championship there's so many teams in contention for?
Oh, I think they'll definitely be looking at it as an opportunity. It brings difficulties, obviously, but I think they will be looking to take maximum advantage of the unique situation where they're allowed to make changes that the others aren't, just because of the change in power unit. And there's pretty strict guidance from the FIA about what they can and can't change. But all the same, if you can justify a change and find another benefit from it, a performance benefit, but justify the change on the grounds of architectural differences in the engine, then you're going to do it. And I'm sure they'll have been looking at how to do that to the maximum extent. And yeah, I'm sure, as Gary said, I'm sure there's probably going to be details on that car that are going to upset the others. But I think McLaren will be in fairly belligerent frame of mind about that, given that they were very upset with the interpretation allowed for the Racing Point last year. So, I'm expecting quite a lot from the team this year. I think they're going to be in there pitching, for that, certainly for the third place. Depending on getting above that depends on really the performance of Red Bull and Ferrari. So that's not really in their hands. But yeah, I think. Certainly the layout of the engine, the two engines are quite different. And the Mercedes has the split turbo with the compressor up the front and the turbine at the back, whereas the Renault had both units combined hanging out the back. Very different plumbing for the intercoolers, Gary was saying. So yeah, there's a lot of change that they will have to make, and within that, I think that's going to create opportunities.
I'd just like to add there, Mark, that I would classify the FIA's ability to decide whether the changes that McLaren are making are necessity or by requirement, I suppose you might need to call it. Similar to track limits, does a driver drive off the track because it's just been nice to the tyres so he can ease the load up a little bit, or is it because he's quicker? They keep just changing the decisions on track limits as to whether it's faster or slower, and the penalties for it. And I think reading what McLaren have done and had to do, I think it'll be a very difficult thing for the FIA to decide whether it's beneficial to the performance of the car relative or just relative to the engine performance. So I'll wait this space to see what happens.
Yeah, it's a multi-dimensional issue, isn't it? That because as Gary points out, it's not like there is a binary. Yes, this is beneficial to performance or not. There's so many different ways, and I was just going to add, I'm really looking forward to seeing sort of if there is anything visible on the 21 car where there's something that basically the thing that's furthest away from where the engine is that's clearly different from last year. And how controversial that is and how McLaren justifies it. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that they're suddenly going to turn up with new front suspension or something and be like, yeah, no, that's definitely for the cooling for the power unit. But it will be interesting to see visually, or try to see visually, just how much they push the boat out with this. Because the simple fact, and I think you referenced it, Ed, that they're talking about having as many new parts on the 21 car as they did for 2020, which was a brand new car, that is not the sign of that doesn't seem to me like the sign of a team that's only done the bare minimum that it had to do. They've done as much as they can do, absolutely.
Well, this brings us now to the front. Red Bull, probably the team that everybody's hopes for a dramatic title fight are hinging on. So come on, Mark, what do we think they need to do? What can they do? Should we be optimistic?
Should be cautious, I think, because we've seen so often in the past, haven't we, with Red Bull, that they come in very, very confident. They test in the winter and it looks not quite there, but they're still sort of confident. And then you get the first race and they're off the pace. And they're right bang on the pace by the end of the year, but it's taken most of the season to get there. And that's a pattern we've seen probably 3 times in the last 4 seasons. So, yeah, we've got to be cautious. But they made quite a significant change in the aero philosophy of their car last year, and they went to the narrow nose with the cape, and that really seems to have been. We talked to them at the end of the year. That really seems to have been at the root of the difficulties that they're experiencing, and which took them most of the year to get on top of. But now that they're very, very gung ho, as I said earlier on, that concept that they have, that combination of the way that they've done that with their traditional high rake preference, they're still very gung ho that is a better concept with more potential than the low rake one. Now I'm sure Mercedes would argue that they don't believe that, and obviously they don't believe that because they've gone a different way. But even at Mercedes, he talked to James Allison. He said, "We don't know. You'd have to develop the two completely different cars, and over a couple of years to actually know." He said, "We feel that this is ours is better, and Red Bull feel that theirs is better, and that there's more potential in there to be untapped." But they're certainly inside there. They're very gung ho. So if we couple that with whatever Honda's got in store for its final year, and they're set to give it a big effort in their last official year, it's not impossible that they could really come out fighting Mercedes. So I'm very hopeful, but I'm cautiously hopeful.
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier there about the Racing Point, they're the only team really on the grid that's got a comparison between this high rake and low rake philosophy. And they've done both, and they're pretty gun ho on the low rake philosophy right now. But if you go back to Red Bull, I'm sure that the high rake solution generates more downforce, and I think one thing that Adrian Newey has shown over the years, he buys into and believes what he thinks. So he will pursue that to the 10th degree just to actually get the best out of it somewhere along the line. But one of the beliefs on the way with a high rake is you've got to really sort of tie it into a little window of movement. These cars move around quite a lot, and you got to tie it into more of a tighter window than the low rake car, just to get it to keep working consistently. And I don't think you can actually do that. Through my time, I've found that if you found X percentage of downforce, but it meant you had to sort of tighten up the working window of the car, you never got the benefit out of it. The odd occasion it would jump up for you, and you just get it spot on, and it would give you the reward. But you just didn't have that window of consistency. You didn't have that opportunity all the time to get 99% out of it. It was either 100% and it was fantastic, or it was 95% and you were back down the grid a bit. So I don't disagree with the fact that I'm sure Red Bull see the high rake as being able to be more beneficial given more downforce. But I don't understand. If you look at one snapshot in time, I agree with that. I don't think you can take it right through the whole season. And that's what Mercedes are very good at, having a car that's, I'd say pretty good, but actually exceptionally good everywhere. The odd occasion, as I say, Red Bull have got them, but that's always going to happen. Somebody will always be that little bit better for one or two occasions. I think with these changes in the regulations on the floor, my belief is that the high rake cars will get hurt more. I've never seen a set of circumstances where, unless you can do all that ducting work on the sides of the floor, and even the knife edge sides on the floor, the small turning vanes, they make such a difference to a car with high rake, but they make a lesser difference to a car with a low rake. They're still beneficial, but they make a lesser difference. So I think by doing away with all that, the high rake cars will suffer more than a low rake car.
I don't have a great deal of confidence in Red Bull starting the season as strongly as they ended last year, purely because whenever you spoke to someone at the team last year and asked them if they'd understood why it had happened again, they never really seemed to fully understand why. I think the greatest sort of argument for avoiding that this year is obviously the extent of the carryover and the fact that they were doing trackside tests with the new floor regulations at the end of last year. So they haven't made that mistake of pushing so hard to the end of the previous season that they compromise themselves at the beginning. There's clearly only a small amount of work that needs to go on relatively on the car to make it a Mercedes challenger, because they are the closest competitor. One thing I would add is, which I think is a significant thing not to overlook, is the new Honda engine for 2021. It was the engine that was originally going to be designed for the new technical rules in 2021, the new chassis technical rules. It was then pushed back to 2022 in line with the new chassis rules being delayed. But then after the start of the season and the extent of the Mercedes step last year, which caught Honda by surprise, they then made the decision to revise the timeline again and bring that engine back to 2021. So quite a lot of work went on behind the scenes to make sure they were able to do that. They're obviously not letting on in terms of what technology they're pursuing or what the changes are. It's not a new engine in the sense of the massive architectural change that they made in 2017, where they went towards that Mercedes, the split of the compressor and the turbine, as Mark described it earlier. But it is what they characterise as an all-new engine. They've tried to refine every area. They're seeking gains on the combustion side and on the ERS side. It did seem that they had a weakness, Honda versus Mercedes, when it came to energy deployment, particularly at the very end of a long straight or at the end of a long lap. So maybe they're seeking efficiency gains there as much as anything else. But yeah, a lot of work has gone in from Honda to bow out on a high. And I wouldn't underestimate that, because I think, as we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, they have become a much more competent organisation than they were in the first few years of the hybrid era.
Shall we finish our rundown of the teams on an ominous note? Gary, Mercedes, how do you improve on perfection? And in the context of what we were just saying about Red Bull, we should remember the last Mercedes upgrade last year was race 7 at Spa.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing you've got to take into account. Mercedes, over the regulations, be it the hybrid regulations or any of the changes since 2014, they've managed them pretty well, I think. And more importantly, I think whenever you did see them maybe struggle a little bit at the pre-season testing or have a little bit of a question mark over their performance, by the time they got to the first race or the second race or whatever, they were on top of it pretty quickly. So they definitely have a very good ability to understand a situation and react to it. I think one of the things that they did for 2020 was the DAS system, which they never really got that much out of, and they never really got on top of how to use it. And again, for 2021 now, you can't use it. So they may have lost a bit of the time to exploit how to get tyre temperature, how to get consistently tyre temperature for qualifying that little bit better. Because other teams didn't have a DAS system, so they were just using the normal principles of it. But if you take Red Bull to competition with Mercedes, Nürburgring was Red Bull's closest to Mercedes over a race weekend, and they were 0.23% slower than Mercedes. Whereas at the last race, and we all jump in there and say, "Oh, Red Bull finished the season really strongly." Mercedes were only 0.026% behind Red Bull. So it was the last race of the season was Red Bull's, but it was a blink of an eyelid between the two of them. So I think that the competition is going to be really, really tough between those two. But Red Bull, the biggest challenge for Red Bull is start the season well. They don't have to start it by winning, but they have to start it by being there, breathing down Mercedes' neck to get Mercedes to have to think in a different direction. There's been too big a gap at the beginning of the year. Before you know it, Mercedes have 30, 40 points, and suddenly the championship's more or less over. They've got to stop that happening this year and keep those points deficits into single figures or something. So hopefully they can do that. And if we get the season we think about, Mercedes do a good job, Red Bull do a little bit better. They're up there. Racing Point just pull it together that little bit better. And Vettel gets his mojo back. McLaren, the Mercedes engine benefited to the best they can. Ferrari does a good engine and gets a better car. You learn a lot more from a bad season than you do from a good season. So Ferrari might have that advantage. A miracle happens at Renault, and Fernando Alonso comes back as a youthful driver. You never know. The season could be absolutely fantastic. I hope so. I think it's great. I think it's what we should be looking forward to.
So there we go. Gary predicts 0.2 seconds covering everyone in qualifying. I was going to say Melbourne, but of course it's Bahrain now. But Mark, just a final point on Mercedes. We keep expecting them to hit this ceiling, don't we, where they just stop finding new points, but they always find ways to do it. Now, you could say carryover car. Obviously, they've got the new modified aero regulations to adapt to, but they're just going to find something, aren't they?
Yeah, they're the best team on the grid. So, why would they be more tripped up by the reg changes than their rivals? I'm going to be controversial and say I expect Mercedes to be quite good. And I mean, it's arguably the greatest Formula One team that has ever been. If you look in longevity of its reign, and how thoroughly on top of every department it is, every component that goes into a winning Grand Prix team, and how they keep their motivation even after all this sort of extensive success. So I'm not expecting any significant change there. It's really down to whether the others, or one or two of the others, can get close enough to put them under any pressure. But it really is. I would be amazed if it's anything more than that.
There are difficulties for Mercedes to overcome. There are challenges that weren't there this year. There's it's little things that add up that just help a team like Mercedes that is so good at avoiding complacency make sure that they definitely don't fall into that trap. It's things like getting rid of the dual axis steering system, adjusting to the fact that they're going to have less aerodynamic testing time than other teams because of the new handicap system that's in place for this year, making sure that they adjust to the budget cap efficiently. And obviously, of course, mastering the aero rules, because anytime there is a change like that, there is always the potential for someone to trip up. But I know that people get really bored of hearing people from Mercedes talk about the extent of the challenges they face and how wary they are of getting caught out. And it often gets met with derision. It's either met cynically or sort of you roll your eyes. And I do it as well. It's kind of like, come on, guys, you can't really believe this, can you? And while they are extremely confident, I'm sure, internally at staying on top, they're also very, very aware that these challenges existed. And I just don't think they take anything for granted. And that's why they just seem to be this anomaly in that this empire doesn't fall. And it doesn't seem like it's going to fall anytime soon. They seem to be the exception that proves the rule. I'm fully expecting them to stay on top. I just wouldn't underestimate the amount of work that's obviously going in to make sure that happens. Not that any of us are underestimating that amount of work. I just mean sort of more generally when people look at it and they think, 2021, lots of carryover from last year, same old, same old. There's a lot of graft being put in by the men and women at Brackley and Brixworth to make sure that 2020 is repeated in 2021.